Chapter 7. Fireflies at the Dune Path. The day of the festival arrived with bright banners along the square and music that sounded as if it had been waiting all year to step into the sunlight. And Aiden woke early with the steady feeling that follows a hard worry solved, because the sketchbook that had made his heart race 2 evenings ago now rested safely on the table by the window, and the small bundle of watercolors that Mira had shown him lived in his mind with a calm glow that nothing could push aside. He brewed tea and watched the root of the cutting lengthen inside the glass, a pale line finding its courage in clear water, and he thought about the promise they had made to begin the lantern soon, about the white heart that would sit close to the candle, about the cobalt that would carry the rich blue of morning into any night. The town outside his window moved with gentle purpose. Stalls rose along the square as neighbors set out baskets of fruit and jars of honey and small bundles of herbs tied with string. Children ran with ribbons and then circled back to the stalls where friends were already tasting slices of early peaches. Aiden, dressed in a simple shirt and comfortable shoes, slipped the sketchbook into his satchel and tucked 2 small cards into the inner pocket, one for the board at the cafe and one for the message line beneath the awning that had appeared during the last market. He crossed the lane with an easy pace and felt as if the whole town breathed together rather than in separate rooms. The bell at the cafe lifted its friendly note, and the owner looked up with a smile that belonged to this day. Aiden placed a few pieces of white glass and 3 small greens in the dish on the shelf and set the card that read, "Pieces taught by the sea. Take one for hope." And then he added a pressed leaf that Mira had given him for the morning, a delicate sprig that carried a clean fragrance and a memory of moonlit benches. He wrote on the board that the lantern would begin tomorrow and drew a small square to stand for the frame with a tiny blue circle at the center. And he felt a soft lift in his chest that was part pride and part gratitude. He lingered only long enough to drink a cup of tea and watch the way the light in the front window passed through the fern fronds and lay in thin shapes on the table where so many notes had begun. Then he stepped back into the square and let the day gather him in. The festival welcomed him with steady energy rather than noise. Musicians sat near the fountain and played a tune with a good sway. A neighbor set out a pan of cinnamon rolls and a sign that said "Warm now," and the air grew sweet with a scent that could make even stern faces soften. The lighthouse keeper had a table with shells that had been polished by sand alone and a small picture of the beam on a winter night. A row of painters had set up easels near the old clock, and Aiden drifted along their line and admired the way one hand liked big shapes and another liked tiny dots and another seemed to paint light itself. He met Mira near a stall of wooden toys where a little mill made from driftwood turned slowly in a bowl of water. She wore a simple dress with a ribbon that matched the color of damp seagrass and had a small canvas bag across her shoulder. And when she turned to face him, he saw the calm in her eyes that meant she had slept well and had arrived at the morning with an open mind. They walked together through the square and let the stalls lead them. She bought a jar of local honey for the greenhouse tea and a small bowl fired by a neighbor who worked behind the bookshop. He bought a folded sheet of handmade paper that held small bits of pressed flowers inside the pulp, and he promised to use it for a letter that asked for nothing and trusted the answer. They watched a group of students sing a simple song about the harbor and then listened while an older woman told a story about the first market in the town before the road was paved. A story that made everyone lean in closer and then laugh with relief when the old cart that had almost rolled down the hill had stopped at a puddle and decided to behave. They ate bowls of soup at a long table where strangers welcomed them as if they had known them since childhood. And then they stood for a while under the awning of a ribbon stall when a short rain arrived out of a clear sky and tapped a fast rhythm that made the musicians smile and change their tune to match. As the afternoon softened, they moved to the edge of the square to rest. Mira asked if he might like to escape the late noise and walk the dune path where the town liked to leave the evening alone. Aiden agreed at once with the private relief that comes when two people choose the same pace. They took the road past the bakery and the alley with the mural, then crossed behind a row of small houses where cats eyed them from garden walls and sparrows kept their talk light in the hedges. The air cooled a little. A light wind moved in from the water and carried the patient smell of salt and the faint memory of rain. The path began as a narrow track of sand that ran between tall grasses and then curved along the back of the beach where the dunes rose in smooth shoulders. The sky had changed from bright blue to a soft wash of pale gold, and the first stars waited in the high east. They climbed slowly, not to reach a place, only to let the town fall behind. The festival music thinned to a comfortable thread that moved along the ground and then faded a little more with each bend. At the top of a low rise, they paused and looked back. The square was a small cluster of lanterns now, and the lighthouse had begun its calm turn, a reliable blink that wished ships an easy night. A path of flat sand curved away beneath their feet, and on either side of it tall grass waved its seed heads as if 100 small hands greeted them and then made room. Mira told him that, on certain summer nights, the field beyond a stand of beach plum shrubs filled with fireflies as if the air itself wore a necklace of tiny lights. She said the first time she had walked here as a child, she had thought the plants had learned to bloom with light the way another plant blooms with petals. And her aunt had told her that some lights belong to the air and some to the stem, and that both are to be cared for. Aiden smiled at the image and tucked it into the part of his mind where drawings live before they reach paper. They followed the faint line of the path until the town had turned to a hush and the only sounds left were the sea and their steps and the clean whisper of grass. The fireflies found them the way gentle news finds a patient listener. One appeared near Myra's shoulder and then drifted low. Another floated near Aiden's hand. Then a few more lifted from the darker pockets of the dune edge and began to mark the air with unhurried points. Soon the field had the look of a night sky pulled down and set within reach. The glow rose and fell in a rhythm that seemed to breathe. No light barked. No light demanded. Each small signal respected the dark around it, and that respect made the whole place feel calm and certain. They stood without speaking for a long minute and then found a place among the dunes where the sand had cooled. Mira took 2 jars from her bag, small glass with holes punched in the lids for air, and set them beside her knees. She did not reach for the lights. She only watched. Aiden said he liked the jars, and she nodded and said she brought them because there is a joy in looking closely, and that sometimes a small circle of air with a gentle visitor inside can teach a lesson that an open field cannot. She said she never took the jars home and never sealed them tight. She said the moment belonged to the night, and that if we can learn from looking and then give back right away, we keep the trust of small things. They waited until a single firefly came near 1 jar and then hovered above it. And Mira lifted the lid with 2 fingers and let the light wander in without any chase at all. It settled on the side of the glass and made a soft bloom. She set the jar between them. Aiden leaned close and saw the true shape of the small body, the way the light was not a star but a living pulse. They looked for a minute and then lifted the lid and let the guest go. The jar rested on the sand and held a little memory of green that faded and then was gone. Aiden murmured that this was how he wanted his drawings to behave. Bright for a moment and then willing to leave their moment alone, and Mira understood. They spoke then about dreams because the night had made the topic safe. She asked what he hoped to make in the coming season besides a lantern. He said he wanted to draw a series for the town library, quiet scenes of corners where people did patient work. A hand turning a page, a pair of reading glasses next to a notebook, a child arranging picture books by color just to see how they look. And he wanted the series to be gentle enough that someone could look at one drawing for an hour and feel their own breath settle. He added that sometimes he feared a return of the city noise that had once filled his head and made quiet work feel small. He said he worried that if he let himself want too much, he would invite the noise back in. Mira listened as she always did, with an attention that steadied the words of the person who spoke. She told him that what he called noise sounded to her like a memory of hurry, and that a person can keep a room ready for hurry without opening the door. She said the greenhouse had taught her to choose her pace even when the calendar did not behave, because plants do not know the word deadline, and that kindness to oneself is a kind of water that keeps roots from drying out. He thanked her for that simple thought and placed it in his pocket as if it were a stone from the shore. He asked about her own hopes. She said she wanted to open the greenhouse for late walks once a week during the warm months and invite neighbors to come sit and watch a night flower open if it felt like opening. And she wanted to write short notes about the feeling of being in a room where plants teach people to lower their voices. She said she worried sometimes that people might not understand how quiet can be a gift and might look for something louder in a place not meant for loudness. Aiden told her the board at the cafe had already prepared the town to love quiet, and that the late walk idea sounded like the right shape of welcome. He said he would draw a small card for the board that invited people to bring patience and leave with a friend they did not expect, and she laughed softly and said that would be perfect. The fireflies gathered more thickly near a cluster of beach plum shrubs, and they drifted closer and sat again. The lights kept their unforced rhythm. The sea made its patient sound. The grass whispered. The lighthouse turned toward them, then away. Aiden breathed in the simple truth that the world is at its most beautiful when it remembers not to rush. He told Mira that he had learned something from the day he feared his sketchbook gone. He said that he had learned it was possible to hand something private to the world by accident and still have the world hand it back with care, and that this had made a new room inside him where trust could sit. Mira told him that finding the book had taught her something similar. She said she had learned that courage can feel like a quiet yes rather than a large shout, and that when she showed him the watercolors she had felt like a person opening a window rather than a person leaping, and that this felt like truth she could live with. They shared the memory of that evening in the greenhouse as if it were part of the light that moved between the shrubs. The conversation turned toward smaller fears. He admitted he was sometimes afraid that the faces he drew were too kind, that he softened them because he needed gentleness himself, and that critics might say he avoided edge and shadow. She replied that kindness was not the absence of edge but the choice to see edge and also see the light that lives inside it. She said she trusted a drawing that understood shadow and still decided to hold a warm line. He admitted he feared he might fail to finish the lantern in the way he could see it in his mind, and she offered to take care of the parts that ask for steady hands and a knowledge of wire, and they smiled at the comfort of shared work. She admitted she worried that her greenhouse nights might attract more visitors than the room could hold, and he offered to make a small guideline card that helped people be guests to plants. And they smiled again because they were already practicing sharing the work of a life that bent in similar ways. The lights around them thickened briefly and then passed into a thinner pattern as a small wind lifted and moved along the dunes. They let the jars rest and did not try to collect more. They watched a tiny procession of sand beetles make their careful lines and then vanish beneath the crest of a small ridge. They listened to the far sound of a song from the square and smiled to know that joy could continue without them and not feel abandoned. They spoke in a lower voice now about the kind of peace that can arrive between two people when both have learned to keep certain rooms quiet. Aiden said peace in his chest felt like a whisper under a door that keeps moving even when the house is noisy, and that being with her made that whisper easy to hear. Mira said peace felt to her like a greenhouse at midnight, not silent, but full of small sounds that do not compete, and that being with him made those small sounds ring true. They sat with that for a while and did not try to turn it into something larger than it already was. The night grew deeper. Stars multiplied above the field. The fireflies kept their patient lanterns alive and then let them dim, alive and then dim, and the whole scene seemed to pulse like a slow heart. They spoke about plans for the next day when they would begin the lantern. They decided to meet at the greenhouse just after the heat had left the glass, to arrange the pieces on a cloth and see what the daylight asked for and what the evening asked for, to drill the soft holes near the edges with care and hang each piece with thin wire that would not pinch, to set the white heart low and to test the balance again and again until the lantern moved like a small boat that had found its water. They decided to set the lantern near the window during the day so that neighbors who walked by could feel the calm of colored light, and to carry it into the greenhouse at night when the candle could make the blue feel like a bell. They promised to be patient if the arrangement changed on them, to let their hands listen to what the glass said rather than to force the design to match a drawing made too early. They spoke about leaving a small note at the cafe when it was done that thanked the sea. When they rose at last, it was not because the night had ended but because their bodies had agreed it was time to return to town. They lifted the jars and shook the last grains of sand from the lids and slipped them back into the bag. They walked the path with a slow stride that kept the calm in their legs. At the top of the low rise, they looked back one more time at the field of lights and said a quiet good night to the small beings who had shared themselves. They took the bend that brought the square into view. The festival was still alive but softer. Lanterns glowed along the edges. People carried blankets and baskets. The musicians had moved to a tune that sounded like a ride home. The cafe window shone and showed the fern like a kind hand against the dark. They stepped into the lane that led to the corner where they often parted and then lingered because the night deserved that. Aiden thanked Mira for the path and for the jars and for the way she always made every small thing feel like it had been the point all along. She thanked him for the patience he brought, for the way he let a view grow to fit his eye rather than forcing it, for the way he returned a fear to its right size. They stood very close but did not rush a gesture. They let peace move like a whisper between them, the kind that says we have time. He said he would bring the sanded board at sunset tomorrow. She said she would bring wire and a cloth to soften the table and a kettle for tea. They smiled without needing anything more and then said good night in voices that understood what they had said without any extra words. Aiden walked home on a street that smelled faintly of cinnamon and wet grass. He climbed his steps with an even breath and set his satchel on the table and took out the sketchbook that had found its way back to him as if it had been practicing that route for years. He opened to a fresh page and drew a low field with clear dots of light, then added 2 small jars at the edge with open lids and wrote "Look, Learn, Return." He set the pencil down and went to the window where the cutting lived and saw that the root had made a small fork, a tiny decision toward more life. He smiled and poured water to the correct height and turned off the lamp. The window let in the clean sound of the sea. In the square a few notes drifted and then fell away. The room held the simple weight of a day that had asked nothing more than attention and had offered more than enough in return. He stretched out on the bed and pulled the light blanket over his legs and allowed sleep to rise like the tide he now trusted. His last thought before the wave reached him was of the dune path still alive with tiny lanterns, of the gentle shape of Mira's face in that kind light, and of the certain promise that tomorrow they would place the first piece of glass into a frame that would give their quiet work a glow that anyone could carry in the mind long after the candle